And for some analysis on this, we're now joined by Chief Economist at Econometrix, Dr. Azar Jammine, and he joins us now via our video link. Dr. Azar, thank you so much for your time this evening. Always a pleasure talking to you on the late edition. And just looking at that insert that we saw from my colleague, I'm sure many South Africans, as we await the announcement of that cabinet by President Cyril Ramaphosa, one would ask, what actually informs the salary of a minister or a deputy minister?
There are several factors that influence the salaries of ministers and deputy ministers. One needs to take into account the degree of responsibility that those ministries have, and also the amount of work that needs to be done. But also one needs to compare them in relation to what corporate leaders are earning in the private sector as well. And then one realizes that the actual salaries that are paid to ministers and deputy ministers are not over the top. As Dawie Ruet suggested, however, the real problem in South Africa, if you want to call it a problem, is that there are far too many ministries, and therefore, compared with the rest of the world, analyses show that we have the third highest number of cabinet ministers and deputy ministers of any country in the world. And therefore, proportionately, we are spending more on the cabinet than most other countries. Having said that, even if you add all the numbers together, the amount that we spend on the cabinet directly is relatively minor compared with overall government expenditure. You know, overall government expenditure is in the region of 2.5 trillion rand. So the amount that we spend on the cabinet is really far less than R1 billion. It's a fraction of the overall level of the government expenditure. The first problem is that there are a lot of additional perks that come with being a minister, and secondly, a hell of a lot of staff that are allocated to each minister, partly for security purposes, partly for secretarial work, etc. And you wonder whether so many of those are needed. But for me, the biggest problem of all in having such an unwieldy cabinet is that each cabinet seems to be running in a direction of its own, and rather than where there is so much overlap in the work that many of these ministries need to do, that we see a complete incongruence and lack of direction resulting from there being far too many cabinet ministries, each running in their own direction, rather than actually rationalizing and concentrating on every effort. When you talk of economics, I mean, you are talking about three different departments: ministry, finance, trade and industry, state-owned enterprises. You could add others as well. When you're talking about education, you've got higher education and lower education. Then on top of that, well, it used to be a separate department, science and technology. When you're talking about police, you've got prisons, you've got, and each one runs around in a different direction. And that has been the most costly aspect of having an unwieldy large cabinet. Not the fact that the actual number of ministries is so big, but the fact that there has not been enough coordination and collaboration between the different ministries. And on the contrary, you've had them each vying for their own turf, and in a way that has often become very counterproductive.
And staying with the topic of salaries, and one would ask, in your observation, the salaries that the ministers and deputy ministers and the overall cabinet gets paid, do you think, in your view, it is a fair salary?
I do believe it's a fair salary if a minister does a decent job. In fact, I believe it could even be on the low side when I see what corporate executives are earning in relation and to the kind of responsibility that should be undertaken by a minister of a particular entity. In that regard, the real problem that we have is that these appointments are often made for political reasons rather than in terms of the competence of the ministers involved. And that is where the problem really arises. And the question one needs to ask or suggest is that in some instances, you probably find that the minister is earning far too little compared with his real contribution, and in other instances, far too much, because in fact, he can often be adding negative value to the economy. And and therefore even 2.5 million, 3 million rand is way overpriced from that point of view. But in other instances, a minister worthy of his mettle should be earning 5-10 million rand a year.
And Dr. Azar, I mean, you even said a bit earlier on that when you look at the overall budget in our country, when it comes to paying cabinet ministers, it really isn't, like you're saying, really exorbitant. But you also say that some of these departments can actually be merged. And do you think that when the president puts together his cabinet, especially with the price tag that we are looking at, and now that we find ourselves with this GNU, do you think that somehow we can see a smaller cabinet, or because of the number of political parties now that we are seeing, that it can still, be expanded to what it is right now?
You've highlighted actually one of the key dilemmas of this government of national unity. Yes, in theory, you could argue that because you've got the government or the president now has to please more political parties, he has to include more members of other parties into the fray, that the temptation will be to keep the number of cabinet ministries as high as it is right now. But I do suspect that the president, in his knowledge of what is really being looked at by investors, both domestically and abroad, may well still decide that certain ministries are superfluous and could easily be merged with others. And I'm hoping that there will be, and I'm looking for the president to actually, to definitely introduce a token reduction in the number of ministries. I think this will go down very well with the public and with international investors and domestic investors. At the same time, he obviously can't go overboard because he's got to please more political parties in making these appointments. But at the same time, I think a lot of the focus will be on where is the emphasis in terms of who does he give the ministries to. In many instances, for example, one would want to, or investor-friendly interests would want to see some of the more investor-friendly political parties having a bigger say in some of the more financially oriented ministries. Others, for example, might be looking for smaller parties, and I think this is what is quite exciting. One could see some leaders of small parties being appointed to positions such as a Ministry of Small Business to start making a difference and exerting pressure in an area where that has basically largely been neglected by government.
Dr. Azar, thank you so much for your time this evening here in SABC News. That's Dr. Azar Jammine. He is the Chief Economist at Econometrix.